painting, but the museum shop bookseller just agreed to carry my book in the Rijksmuseum store. So dream come true for sure.
That's good.
What's that? Is there a question? Oh, okay, I'll keep going. So I want to ensure you, if you have any interest in reading about this topic, that I did do my research, I did my work, and the culmination of that, as you can see in the center photo, is me back in 2000, I think it was 15, in the English village. And because I thought it was necessary to really transport myself back into the 17th century to get this right and get all the details right. And so I was fortunate enough to work there. So let's talk about the history. Hopefully you can see my screen well. So my background is actually this photo. It's one of my favorite images. That is the Hooglandse in Leiden. One of my favorite parts of doing the research was going to the places and structures and walking the steps that the pilgrims walked. And this is one of my favorite photos. So what were the things that allowed me to put the details into this novel? They were paintings from the 17th century, like Averkamp, books and rare books at that. I went to Brown University, the Boston Public Library. I started this process before the internet was really rich and full of the content that it is now. So I had to do some old school digging, which I really enjoyed. Like I said, travel over to England and the Netherlands was my favorite. And in fact, my husband would ask me, do you really have to make another trip over there? And of course I did. Working closely with the experts and finding people whose passion was also this history and who's really dedicated their lives to it, including some of the amazing people we have. Just, I live in Duxbury, Mass, so that's just north of the plantation, now called Plymouth, Patuxent. So just incredible people willing to share their knowledge. So you may ask, well, what am I writing about that's so unique that really just, made me think this was necessary to spread to the world? So probably the key piece was the Netherlands piece, that there were half the people that ended up on the ship that had spent a decade in the Netherlands. I had no knowledge of that. So that was one key thing. I thought everybody knew each other on the ship. How could they not? They're packed down there like sardines in this below decks. No, that's not the case. They were all English principally, but they all didn't have the same path leading up to boarding that ship. So I thought also this whole thing was about religious freedom, and for sure there's a component, and we'll get into that, but that's not really the common thread. This was a merchant venture. I really had no knowledge of that. Also, I thought this group of people was one-dimensional. I thought they were all clothed in black and somber and sad people, and that's not the case. And I thought it was worth revealing to the world that there's a different story, that there's more to the story. So I'm bringing these people to life, you'll see. And I want you to read this if you have interest to read it. Think of it as a movie. And we're taking names that we typically just read about, and we're bringing these people to life, and we're making it relatable to our own lives. And there's a lot that's relatable, surprisingly, 400 years later. So I issued my initial edition. Can you hear me?
No. Can now.
Okay, great. Thank you. So what's different and what's worth reading this book for, or the new edition? So there's 20 new, there's visuals now. I really thought after the fact, I thought, this would really be beneficial and much more enhanced if I had visuals and I had maps. So there are a number of maps, original maps. You can see here that I have, I hope you can see this, it's not blocked. Let me try to ensure that's the case. So I have a geographical cast, and you can see which chapters are in which locations, and you'll see it's dominated by Leiden and London. The other key feature, and hopefully you can see my cursor, going north from London, the Great North Road, this was the main road going up to Scotland, and this happened to also be in Elizabethan and King James times a royal post road. As you see, it cuts through this town called Scrooby, which you may have never heard of, which I'd be surprised if you did, unless you were super into this history. This is where William Brewster lived. for many years. And this, where he lived, was at the Archbishop of York. And this was a postal stop. That gets to be a significant feature as we move forward in this. So again, I try to take you back in time. I try to bring the 17th century to life. And how do I do that? Again, making it relatable. And we're with our fictional characters, they allow us to do a number of things that maybe the factual characters I wouldn't feel comfortable doing, because I'm trying to honor history and respect it. So there is romance, religion, of course, politics. It's important to understand that foundation, milestones in life, birth, marriage, death. And then I get into great detail when it comes to like what life was like with the clothing and the food. I want you to know what it was like to live back then. That's one of the main purposes of writing this book. Whoop. So, political landscape, like I said, I have to set the stage here. We have to get some rules laid out. So the novel starts in 1587. At that time, Queen Elizabeth I, who most people have heard of at least, she is the ruler at the time. She is Protestant. So I don't want any confusion to exist. The Church of England at this time is Protestant. And it also remains Protestant when her successor, King James I, takes the throne in the year 1603. So this painting here, this is another visual featured in my 400th anniversary reprint, is depicting the death of Queen Elizabeth I, which occurred in 1603. As I said, this hangs in the Louvre. I just think it's a fascinating painting, and I think it just shows her character. You can get a sense of what she's thinking and feeling, just her body position, how she's looking at, and I'm not even sure who that is bowing down to her, but sort of not with disdain, but just like even in the throes of death, she still has control and still has her strength. So what's significant about Elizabeth I, though, is this something you might not know. William Brewster, who was on the Mayflower and an elder in the congregation that ends up in the Netherlands, he actually worked as a clerk for the Secretary of State, William Davison. So William Davison was Elizabeth's Secretary of State. So William Brewster was actually in the courts of Queen Elizabeth. Now, he would not have been in direct dialogue with her, but still he would have been in the court and in her presence, which I find fascinating. Now you'll find in the book that his Secretary of State ends up in the Tower of London, which is where the book begins. So again, I think maps are important to give you geographical context, and this is kind of busy, so I apologize for it's a little bit of confusion. I've melded a couple of the maps. But here I want you to see, so get your bearings. So this is London, is Elizabethan times. Here's your River Thames coming through here. Where my cursor is, hopefully you can see, is the Tower, or I'm sorry, London Bridge. And to the right, a little bit east, is the Tower of London grounds. So where I have Secretary Davison being imprisoned is the Salt Tower, which still exists today. This is an actual picture from one of my trips.
I don't have to be disturbing you.
It's a fantastic bit structure itself. So now if you go a little bit west, you will see here, it comes down and there's St. Paul's Cathedral here. It's a bit hard to see. And then you have some like little ovals, and they say sign of the rose, and this is sign of the black bear, sign of the brown bear. Most of the buildings did not have numbers. They had signs, and they had depictions on those signs. So these are important because these are print shops or print stalls. You'll find that the printing press is a very important component of this book. It's important in a lot of ways, because William Brewster ends up getting involved in publishing, but our main fictional family is a master printer named Nicholas Oakes, and he ultimately runs this Sign of the Rose and has this book stall at the Sign of the Black Bear. So the question now is, what happens when King James takes the throne? So William Brewster and those in his congregation are looking for reform. And so you need to understand the distinction here. This is important. They're looking for reform within the Church of England, which is Protestant. And what kind of reform are they looking for? They're looking for the church to remove any sort of remnants that they have in place from the Catholic years. So they want to purify the church, but they want to take it a step further. And when James takes the throne, he doesn't offer any sort of reform. In fact, he tightens the reins and demands conformity. So the hopes are dashed pretty quickly when he takes the throne in 1603, and Brewster and others in his congregation determine the only way to worship God properly is to separate from the Church of England, which is a problem because it's illegal and punishable by death. So around 1607, they see they have no choice. They need to separate from the church, which means they need to leave England, but you can't do so without a pass for ports, where we get the term passport. So they leave, and it's fraught with complexity and issues. It could probably be its own book. I don't want to spoil too much, so I won't say too much. But this is a jail cell in Boston, England, that Brewster and some others became very well acquainted with. We do have an inkling that they end up in the Netherlands, which is true. They first ended up in Amsterdam, actually, in about 1608. And then for a number of reasons that the book will get into, I won't bog you down with here, they end up removing once again to the city of Leiden. So where is Leiden in context to Amsterdam? It's not very far. It's about 25 miles south and west, and not very far from the North Sea either, just a bit east of the North Sea. So what's so special about Leiden, you say? This map is also in the book. So this particular map features the landmarks of the city. It's a very walkable city. To give you an idea, if you've not been fortunate enough to go, I hope you can get there someday. It's one of my favorite places. All right, so let's look at number one. Number one is the Peterskerk. So kerk in Dutch is church. This is the St. Peter's Church. If you were to walk from the St. Peter's Church to the Hooglanderkerk, which is the church in the picture of my background, you are looking at a very short walk, less than 10 minutes. So you can see quite a walkable city. So I have another map in the book that shows where people lived, but what's important about Leiden and why Brewster, Bradford, these are the names that you're going to get intimately involved with. Carver, John Robinson is their pastor, and John Robinson, on a separate map you'll learn, he lived right about here. And what's important about where he lived is he lived in a main house, but he had purchased 13 small houses around that. He thought it very important to be close to his congregation and know everybody quite well. So why did they end up in Leiden? Part of the reason is the university that existed there. So in 1575, the University of Leiden was incorporated. This was shortly after, almost immediately after, a terrible siege of the Catholic Spanish. So the city was rebuilding. They were granted the university by William of Orange, as you can say, a gift. But with this university came a lot of opportunities, not just the university itself, but there were botanical gardens and an anatomy theater, which I'll show an image of later. There were markets all throughout the city. So where this new Rhine is, Wednesdays and Saturdays, this river, and still to this day, which is amazing, are markets, and they have food and clothing and other household items. And that was the case even back then. Cheese, fantastic cheese if you like cheese. And in this city, they were able to worship as they wanted, pretty much unbothered. So books, I note here. So books, remember, again, printing press and the importance there. The university was here, so of course there was quite a demand for books, just from the university alone. So quite a few printers, etc. So, oh, jumping ahead too much. So additional images that you'll find in this book. I think it's important also to give you some exposure to the 17th century and the culture of the era. So it's the Dutch Golden Age. This is the era of Rembrandt, Vermeer, most of the famous Dutch painter names that you've probably heard of before. On the left-hand side is a painting that hangs also in the Rijksmuseum, also in my novel, and it's of what's called vanitas. So this is a genre that when you're viewing the painting, you want to pay attention to specific items that are very commonly found in vanitas paintings, such as skull and bones, a glass maybe that's half full, instruments, drawings, works of art. So here's a sculpture, books. This is a painting to remind the viewer that life is fleeting, that material things are really insignificant, and that before not very long, you will be gone from this earth, that mortality is an eventuality. So now we move on to the Anatomy Theater, which is, I think, a fascinating aspect to the university. And we have in a scene in the book characters that go to the Anatomy Theater, they visit it and interact with it, which is really fun. Now, one thing I want to point out here, so you see the cadaver here, they actually would usually use criminals as the subjects here, not surprising, and they would only be having these dissections in the winter because summer months, you can imagine, would be a bit odoriferous. So here also I want to point out, there are women in attendance, which I think is fantastic. Now, they look very nicely dressed. That's something that your wardrobe is going to give away immediately your social status. So all these people here, if you look closely, they're wearing a lot of clothing and expensive clothing. You can tell from this. And that's one thing that Avercamp, the painter who has done the cover of my book, you can glean so much information from what people are wearing and what social status they fit into. So we're going back again, yet again, and bringing up printing and the press and its importance. So again, the printing press in that era was maybe even more important than the internet for us today. And of course, the rulers at the time needed to make sure they controlled it, because they, before long, they could have unrest and whatnot for publications and different perspectives that people were having ease in obtaining by being able to print so many things so quickly. So they're for sure in the Stationers' Company in London. They had layers of inspectors and rules, and you had to have permission and permits to print certain things. So it's very highly controlled. In the Netherlands, as you might guess, it was a little freer, but as time went on, for the people who were there from 1609, let's say, to 1620, the rules became a bit more strict and stringent, and the British government, the English government, was paying more and more attention to what was going on the presses in the Netherlands. So, as I said, the Brewster family is a family with from start to finish. We live with them, we get to know them, we feel almost, or you should, I hope, if I've done my job well, that you're part of their family, really. And they are accompanied, you can say, by the fictional family of master printer Nicholas Oakes, who for the most part remains in London, but there is some travel between the two cities as the novel progresses. Part 2 is mostly taking place in Leiden, but as we kind of like reach the 1620 mark, where everything's heightened, there's a lot of back and forth for a lot of reasons. So we talk about the importance of the printed word, and there is also the importance of general communication, both verbally and also written. So Hugh Mercer, he is a fictional character. He works as a royal post carrier. So back at that time, the post was really a government function. It wasn't so easy to convey communications if you were just a personal, like an individual, not related to the government. But if you knew Hugh Mercer, as the Brewsters do, and as the Oakes do, you had that luxury of transmitting communication with his assistants. So he's important for that reason, but he also becomes a key figure. I find that when I get feedback on the novel, that he is probably the person talked about most, and he's most disliked, I have to warn you. He's involved in the romance, not a surprise. But I try to get you to empathize with him, and maybe you'll flip-flop a little bit. I have a soft spot for him myself, but that's for you to determine. So on the right, what's important here, if you look at the bottom, it's printed in 1617. So this is a publication. If you see this bear here, the people in these historic circles call this the Brewster bear. So this is one of the books known to have been produced by William Brewster and his partner at that time, Thomas Brewer, who was probably the wealthiest associated with the congregation that was worshiping under John Robinson there in Leiden. And this would have been a conservative, very popular publication. So nothing threatening about this, nothing King James would have issue with. In any case, this is one example, but they were quite prolific between 1617, 1618. Then things get a little dicey. They get a little more daring in what they're printing, and then Brewster comes on the radar for King James and ultimately has to go into hiding. So I want to talk about, sadly, I only give one slide to women in the 17th century, which is probably not right, but there's limited time. And again, I want to hear your questions. So they definitely had a voice, for sure. They were very significant influencers. They worked midwives. There were people in Leiden because the textile clothing industry was the dominant industry, and it had to be rebuilt after the devastation of the Spanish siege I mentioned. So there were people that were working as wool combers, wool carders, spinning wool, all sorts of facets of that industry. In fact, you had some people in the congregation that actually ended up doing fairly well, such as Jonathan Brewster, who made ribbon, and William Bradford, who he became a citizen, he bought a house, he probably had 2 looms, and he was a weaver. So going back to the women, which is the purpose of this slide, many in the congregation of John Robinson were literate. In fact, much higher percentage than in, I would say, the general population in England comparatively. So if you were a mother in that era, you were not only you were a wife, you were a mother, you were a teacher, you were caring for your family, resolving their ailments, and you would do so with herbs. You would be managing a kitchen garden if you lived in a city, a much bigger garden if you lived outside of that. You were a confidant. You were talking to your husband behind closed doors. You were a valuable asset and part of the nuclear family, a vital part of that, essential. And we suspect, some believe that Mary Brewster, in fact, as they led up to their departure from Leiden, may very well have been without William and doing this all on her own with 5 children. And initially we believe the whole family was intending to cross, and that not all the family got aboard Mayflower. So here is depicted again, University of Leiden. This is the main academy building, which was a former convent. And this is the botanical garden. So there's also a scene in the book where Rose and Jonathan are walking through the gardens and detailing and highlighting what they're viewing. So that's really interesting. And this would have been open to the public. And the main academy building was interesting because members of the congregation did enroll in the university, such as John Robinson, who was known to debate publicly and famously at the time. So, is everyone hearing me adequately?
Some people are not muted.
Yes, I'm hearing you.
Very good, thank you. So you may ask, why would you remove from Leiden? I'm making it sound like a fantastic, incredible place, which it is. But at the time, you have to consider the situation. So you have this congregation from England. They're there seeking religious refuge. And a lot of them are having to take their trade in the cloth industry, which might not have been their former trade. So for instance, they may have been brewers prior to this and come over, or bakers, and decide, well, I really have the best chance to eke out a living if I work in the cloth trade. So they adapt, just as we are today. But why wouldn't they stay there? I have to tell you that as they neared 1620, a couple of things were happening that were very significant. So in 1619, for example, the Dutch Reformed Church itself was in a fair amount of upheaval. It was altering how people from other countries were being allowed to worship. So in 1619, there was a rule they could no longer worship in a private home. And so this English group actually ended up being assigned to, it's kind of ironic, a former Catholic church where they had to worship. So rules were being tightened and changed. But even more frightening was there was a truce in place that was ending in 1621. So as Bradford says in his diary, they could hear the drums of war were pounding, and they were working diligently to figure out more of a long-term viable solution for stability and better economic situation for their congregation. And they worked through a number of different options. With Dutch investors as well, a number of things, and things fell through. So I'll put the list here. and never like reading to anybody. But it wasn't an easy existence in Leiden for the bulk of the congregation. I mentioned some highlights. Someone like John Carver, you know, he was a successful merchant. I mentioned Thomas Brewer. He was of the gentry class, so he supported them financially quite a bit. We don't hear about him for a reason, and again, I'm not going to give away too much in the book. But for the most part, the majority of the congregation was just getting by. The children were aging quickly. They were working, as Bradford said, sun up to sundown. And some were marrying into Dutch society, and they really wanted to keep their English ways. And some were going into military service. So they thought leaving was really their best chance to not only worship freely, but to a chance to own land and improve their economic situation. This here is an image also in the book depicting cloth production. This hangs in the Laken Hall in Leiden. This is the Textile Museum. This is part of a series. I believe there are 7 paintings by Swanenberg. And this is entitled Plucking and Combing. So you can see here, they're combing the wool back in there. It's hard to see, but in the actual painting, the processing, it's all stages of wool processing, which is very vital to the Leiden economic structure. They're deciding to go. What did they pack? This image here is a good depiction. This is at the American Leiden Pilgrim Museum in Leiden. If you get the opportunity to go to Leiden, you need to go to this museum. Everything you see here in this image is period. It's not reproduction. So that's fascinating in and of itself. Anything made of metal was going with you. Anything pottery, anything cloth. So all of your wardrobe, which in fact made up about 70% of the things you had in your possession, the value of them was in your wardrobe. You were taking every stitch of clothing because guess what? When you arrived, there were no looms. There was no resources to produce clothing. You were trying to grow food to survive. Candles as well, oils, weapons. Let's see the list. So seeds, you had to grow, hopefully, the things you needed to use and that you wanted to grow there if the soil would allow for it. Definitely the bedstead frames, mattress tickings, which you could refill upon arrival. And then you would just jam your cupboards and cabinets full of everything that you couldn't easily get on the other side. I put books at the end, intellectual baggage, because William Brewster, who spoke 5 languages, did bring, in fact, 200 to 300 books. In the anniversary reprint, I have an emblem that looks like a wax seal, and it depicts ships. And that is because, another reason I wrote this book, because there should have been 2 ships that crossed. One was called the Speedwell, and that was the smaller ship that helped transport part of that congregation from Leiden over to Southampton to meet the Mayflower. They were supposed to go together, and the Speedwell was meant to stay in the New World for purposes of fishing, because remember, this is a merchant venture. Investors putting their money forth to hopefully reap a profit. And part of the profit was going to be from goods sent back from the New World, including salted fish. Also included timbers, furs, anything that would fetch a price in England. We don't really ever hear of the Speedwell though, do we? So I'm coming to the end. We're at 30 minutes. Common misconceptions, which motivated me to write this book. So the whole question of black, it's really fascinating to me because black is actually the most expensive color that you can produce. And it's the most expensive because it requires the most number of dyes, so most raw materials, and most number of dyeing, so most labor. People who are wearing black, you see them a lot in portraits because those are the people who could afford to commission those portraits. In reality, the group that crossed on the Mayflower, they were wearing colors such as yellows, greens, blues, reds, grays, browns, and yes, they may have had 1 or 2 articles of black for special occasions, but certainly by no means were they wearing black every day because they simply couldn't afford it. And if you could, you wouldn't be risking your life to cross the sea, to land some unknown place and hope to own land there. The buckles on the shoes and hats, also interesting, but not true. So there were buckles in the period, but in the fashion of the day, they were not on the shoes and hats. And that's just sort of something that evolved over time. They were all Puritans aboard Mayflower. Certainly there were some. Now remember, Puritans were people who were wanting to stay within the Church of England, but just wanted some reform and purification. That group that we focus on going over to Leiden, they would not have been considered that. They would have been separated from the church and therefore a little bit further extreme. So they were all uneducated and poor? Surely not. Many were educated, some degreed, and many literate. And as we know, William Brewster being one of those, but Winslow would fall under the category of educated, Carver for sure. Yesterday was the anniversary of the Mayflower Compact, which the men had signed. And I'm not going to get into why that existed. That'll take too long, but that's an important piece of the history. So they all knew one another on the ship. They didn't. They were from all parts of England, and certainly there were some who knew each other. The congregation from Leiden did. But the others, I mean, they would have boarded that ship, some coming off the Speedwell, and that would have been the first time they had seen some of their shipmates. And then regarding religious freedom, there were some on the Venture that had no issue with the Church of England whatsoever. Certainly our group in Leiden did. They were not only Protestant, they were also Calvinists, so they believed in predestination. But there were many on the ship who had no issue whatsoever with religion, were looking just for land ownership and better economic prospects. So if you do decide to get the book, have a close look at the cover, because that's going to reveal so much to you. It's going to show beggars like the person here and what they were wearing. It's going to show the wealthy, which is right adjacent, and all walks of life in one space. Also, if you get the book, in chapter 17, I believe it is, there is the scene ice skating on the canal, which is this picture. And I'm not very creative. I steal right from the painting. And my two characters, Rose Oakes and Jonathan Bruce, are these two right here. And as they skate, they will weave through the painting. So regarding that, I am going to read from the book. Not that scene, that's the scene I normally read from, but maybe somebody has heard it before and I don't want to bore you. So I'm going to read from chapter 6, which is entitled No Pass Reports, and you will get to hear the training of Plymouth Patuxet. I will do so in dialect. I will do my best because this I practiced only a few times. Taking a sip of water. So set the stage. This is spring 1608. The setting is London. They're at the Sign of the Rose, which is the print shop of master printer Nicholas Oakes. The muddy, deep-rutted roads would surely send post-carrier Hugh Mercer into immediate retirement by way of injury, if not an untimely demise. A dirt-coated face and uniform indicated a wet and sloppy journey, but that could not keep the postal rider from travelling as fast as he and his horse could ride into London. After exchanging letters at the Tower of London, he headed west towards Foster Lane and the Oakes' Sign of the Rose. In this unusual instance, he did not possess any personal letters for Master Printer Oakes, but only verbal hearsay passed along by his carrier counterparts. Mistress Oakes stood by the front shop windows, seeking out bright sunlight on this frosty spring morning. She noticed a man leading a horse begin to slow his pace as they approached the shop, their misty exhalations gliding as the rider secured the lead rope to the metal post outside. Mercer's mud-covered uniform disguised him as she peered through the window, so his presence before her in the front doorway surprised Rose, if not frightened her at this early hour. The luxury of sending and receiving the written word through a trusted source was not a small thing, and for certain, the Oakes appreciated Hugh Mercer and the risk he and his father, Henry, had been assuming for more than 30 years. Since he was a messenger of written and verbal information, his presence might mean the delivery of devastating news as well as anything of a more hopeful sort. "Good day, Mistress Oakes," whispered Mercer, a little short of breath. "I do regret I have only minutes to spare. The roads are slower than ever with the mud and flooding waterways, so I have fallen desperately behind on my route. Please inform Master Oakes I learned from a trusted source that Master Brewster, his family, and some of their group have failed to make their departure from this land. It is being said some of the men from the congregation are across and safely in Amsterdam, but the whereabouts of the others is not entirely known. Some are in the hands of the authorities, others have been released, and their locations remain unknown. That being said, let it be no surprise if some such visitors pass by your sign in need of shelter on their way farther eastward on the Thames. Keep your eyes and ears open in the coming days and weeks. So that is a sampling of what you'll experience if you enter the 17th century with me. That concludes what I had to share with you. I just wanted to thank everybody and also let you know in the book you find the character list, so the fact and fiction, who's real, who's fictional, and then also a glossary at the end, reading recommendations, and also some places to visit as well. Hopefully we'll be able to do that again someday soon. This is the information on my site. Feel free to contact me. If there's anyone out there who has a dream to write a book, please, I'm happy to help. Follow your dream, it's possible. And you know, self-publishing is a mainstream option these days. So please reach out to me if you have any questions. I have a lot of good resources, historians, friends, people who would love to help you.
How do we buy the new edition?
So the paperback edition is available on Amazon. Amazon.com is the easiest way to get it. And then if you're a Kindle person, hold tight. We're working on getting that right. That should be available the week of the 23rd of November. But the paperback is up and ready. And then I'll stop sharing because I do want to do just a really quick show and tell. Hold on one moment. Okay. So my background may mess this up, but hopefully you can see it. So this is a tile from the 17th century. It's depicting a mason, a stone mason. This is also in my book, but I was able to purchase this 17th century tile. If you see behind me, the church is the Hooglandse. Actually, William Brewster buried his son there. But there's an antique shop and right adjacent to the Leiden American Pilgrim Museum where I purchased that tile. So there's so much history that's still alive and for us to experience. So I welcome your questions and comments and appreciate your attention.
Jen, I have a question for you. Given the fact that there was a merchant interest in the group coming over to the New World, and that Jamestown had been in existence for 13 years prior to the departure, and obviously the intent of the Jamestown group was different, but the merchant relationship was still there. Did you encounter in your research any communication or relationship between those involved in Jamestown and the travels and those coming out of the Pilgrim group?
So I have to be honest with you. My knowledge of Jamestown isn't fantastic. I do know, I can tell you, this may answer it partly, but not really well as far as I'm concerned. The original landing spot or the intention of the group on Mayflower was to land in Virginia territory, which at the time, the northern part of Virginia territory was actually the mouth of the Hudson. So they were off target and they knew it. Once they got to Cape Cod, they knew they were too far north. So from that standpoint, gosh, and I have access to people who would know this answer much better, but I would imagine that because they had a patent for Virginia territory, that there was certainly probably some overlap with the merchant adventurers who were investing in this that may have had an association with Jamestown.
Good, thank you, Jen.
Jen, I'm off doing the same thing you are, except in a very, very extremely early stage, in a very unprofessional stage, but I'm putting stuff together to trace my family name back, because I had a notion way back 25 years ago that we may have come here very, very early into this country. So I did get off and start doing the research. And what I've gotten so far, I'm back 14 generations, which takes me into like the 1560s with the same name, going back. My father, grandfather, the whole 9 yards. Fascinating stuff. They were from England, and they came over in 1634 on the Francis. And you described the ships exactly the way I found them. Not that I was on them, but I mean, researching it. 62-day trip, horrible weather in the North Sea. And it's getting to be a fascinating thing. So I started this year with this, COVID thing going on, and I'm retired anyway. I lock myself in my house and say, hey, now I can do the stuff that I couldn't do before. I'm retired also. I'm widowed also. And so I spend my day now putting it together as a book and hope to get a book out in the next year or so. But I've got a ton of material, and I've got 1,000 people in my database easily. And now we just want to put it down as something readable. And it goes through every phase of history from the 1540s right through Plymouth, all the way down through all the wars. I've got a father in every single war in this country, starting with King Philip's and going all the way down to World War II, Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera.
We'll keep at it, because if you have the passion, you can accomplish this, and I wish you the best. And if you need any help, please let me know. And I think to the rest of the audience too, if you want to see more pictures of the research, go to my website. And then also, if you have groups or book clubs or anyone that you think will have interest in learning more about it, I'm willing to spend some time and share with you, because the more this book succeeds and people know this story, the more I can give back. My profits I want to share with the museums, and I just want people to learn. And I'm hoping schools, in fact, my son just said, oh, my history teacher wants a copy of the book. And really, the research is done well enough that the historical community is accepting it. And I just want people to learn, and young people to get excited, about history.
That's great. I do belong to a book club. And they would be very interested in that kind of a spirit. So thank you.
Yeah, I do too. And I live in Plymouth. So next week we're making our suggestions for the next year. So your book is definitely on my list. Some of the people in the book club are actually docents at Pilgrim Hall, including myself. So,
Excellent.
and I just want to comment on this, the connection with Jamestown. There was the one passenger, Stephen Hopkins, who had been at Jamestown. He wasn't one of the, religiously motivated passengers, but he did come over on the Mayflower, and he had been in Jamestown and then on the islands prior to all before the Mayflower.
Thank you, and you're correct. And that's actually, I think somebody just released a book on Stephen Hopkins, so he has a really fascinating background. So people might be interested.
You can see his daughter's hat in the Pilgrim Hall Museum.
Pilgrim Hall is a great place. If anyone's local, wouldn't. Is it open?
No. Donna is trying to open it in, we are in November now, around Thanksgiving, but next week on Wednesday, there's an education committee meeting, so I'll get the latest update then.
Yeah, Donna's
currently open though.
Amazing. If anyone's in the area and once it does open, please, spend some time there. It's well worth it.
So just to clarify, are you willing to come to a book group to speak, or do a Zoom, or, well, assuming we're still doing Zooms, what would your involvement be?
Oh, I'd definitely be willing to come. Yeah, as long as everyone was comfortable with that and wear masks and such. So I'm close by. I'm in Duxbury, so.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
And somebody had a question. My site. So the best way to see all the historic research pictures and get information is beforethemayflower.com. So you can enjoy those pictures and you can get a hold of me. And as far as the ease of getting the book, Amazon is the easiest. And as far as the Kindle, hang tight, as far as the new version with all the images, that I'm optimizing. I wasn't satisfied exactly with how it came out. Regarding the new reprint, I do want to give credit, though. I don't want to forget. Local graphic artist and formatter Julia Blake did the work not only on my cover, but in this reprint, all the images, and she's phenomenal. I think without her, I probably would have given up on it, to be honest. So she's great, and a local artist, and her husband works at Plymouth Detective. So we're all
Jen,
connected.
we have a couple more questions here in the chat box. One person asked if you have any information about Reverend John Robinson's children.
Oh, his children. Oh, goodness. I don't have a good answer there. I can remember some of their names, but wouldn't give you a great answer if I said anything. All I can tell you, well, I don't want to give away too much of the book, but Pastor Robinson was one of the big reasons that congregation flourished in Leiden. He was well regarded in the theological circles. As I mentioned, he debated successfully at the university. His children, I think he had a son named John. You probably know more about them than I do. He was married to, they think, the sister of John Carver's second wife. I want to say Bridget. But my knowledge is not very comprehensive. I apologize.
Well,
he did not make the crossing.
Another question, I'll have to kind of put this into a nutshell, but the question is pretty much regarding the way things nowadays, especially the last few years, have been, the racial reckoning and whatnot. They ask if, with the whole concept of white privilege and whatnot, if you'd written this book now, in present time, would it cause you to recount the history through a new lens? Easy question, I know.
Yeah, I'm just trying to digest that. It probably wouldn't alter too much, only because I'm very, stuck in Europe, in a sense. I don't cover the crossing, and I try to celebrate Leiden rather than get into the impact of their arrival here. I have to tell you, I am sensitive up to it, and to be honest, if I had my way, I have an idea for a second book, and it actually does focus on the impact to the people here and the native people here. And it does bother me actually quite a bit, the impact that it had. So I don't think it would change what I did with this particular book, though.
Another question somebody asked is, did the hierarchy on the Mayflower change from the beginning of the voyage to landfall?
Ooh.
Another good question. I'm not very well versed to answer this. I would say, because there were supposed to be two ships going, the master of ship on the Mayflower was Christopher Jones, and then he had his crew, and he had additional crew, in fact, because he expected, and they had evidence to show based on history that probably about 50% of the people would die, not so much in the crossing itself, but once arriving, right? So he brought extra crew. I don't know how much changed over the course of the trip. This would be a good question for somebody like Whit Airy at Plymouth Patuxent, or Chris Messier, who used to play Master Jones. I do know that, of course, for the group from Leiden, Carver was one of their principal leaders, for sure, and Brewster was also. I'm not sure of the people who came from England and if that changed throughout the course of the crossing. If I answered, I'd be kind of making it up, which I don't like to do. Sorry.
You're muted.
Oh. One of my grandmothers that I discovered going back, I think she's my 13th, was on the Mayflower, and is Mary Chilton. And she was the first woman to step off the Mayflower at the age of, I think, 13 or 14. And she eventually married, I think, Governor Bradford or one of the other famous first governors. And she's buried in Boston. I've been down to her tomb. And that was quite exciting. And my daughters all got all hepped up when they saw that. Oh, wow, a woman made the list. But yeah, she was quite a girl.
I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but according to our training at the museum, that's a myth that Mary Chilton wasn't the first one to step off, and wouldn't have been, because they wouldn't have had a young girl. She was about 14 at the
Well,
time.
she wasn't. She was the first female. What actually happened, and I think this was backed up in the big book on the Mayflower a few years back, which I've got behind me someplace. All the women, from what I read, stayed on board for 4, 5, 6, 7 days, while the men got off, went ashore, and scouted the whole area out, and were able to fix something up. They were just coming off a 30-day, 62-day trip to get over here, and I think on the 7th or 8th day, they allowed all the women, and Mary Chilton's, both her parents died in the crossing.
Yeah.
And she was orphaned during the crossing, and that's the story I've got. And there's a book written on her too, which I got from my daughter to read. She's got that all up in her bookcase now. She loves it. And it was because they were the first parents to die on the way over. And I've had lots of relatives die on the way over. It's becoming a theme.
Well,
I see
we're
the point of tonight's discussion.
Real quickly, Al, I just wanted to comment on some of the questions that came through.
Yes.
I know we're coming up to our time. So somebody asks, let's see.
yes, why use the pen
Is the
name?
the pen name. Right, I just want to answer on the Leiden Museum. So the Leiden American Pilgrim Museum, you can view some things online. And they also have a Facebook page, which is interesting. So you can enjoy that. And then I just wanted to answer, let's see, English living in Holland. Also, how did they manage the language? So interestingly, some of the people are known to have learned Dutch. So Carver likely did. Jonathan Brewster likely knew some and learned it. William Bradford, he owned a house. He probably had 2 looms, and he became a citizen. So that would have been, you would have likely known some Dutch. Someone asked, how often were ships going back and forth in general to the New World? So it depended on the year, not that often. And so I can imagine if you were living in the colony and you saw a ship on the horizon, you might be a little bit fearful even at first. But who's on that ship? What are they bringing? And then you're probably thinking, what am I going to get off of this ship? Because you're not producing clothes or shoes or a lot of things. So you'd be really anxious to see who was on board and what might be in the cargo. Did the Pilgrims know about St. Augustine? I'm not sure. They probably did. I mean, they were very well read. And like I said, Brewster had about 300 books. Not sure on these places though. Probably St. Augustine. I don't know about Cupid's Cove though, so I'd be making that up. Why there was no protection from England, persecution for them in Leiden. There was some protection. So Brewster was being hunted because he supposedly published an inflammatory book. There was a little protection. The university protected them in some cases. So I think Leiden did the best they could there. All right, so real quickly, the pen name. So that actually has some significance. So my last name being Sinsigalli isn't hugely marketable. Sorry to my husband. So in any case, JL stands for my twins. So I started this project in 2003 before they were even conceived of. And when they came into the world, they were born in Boston and they were born 3 months prematurely. So I almost lost them a couple of times. So J is my daughter Jade, L is my son Luke, and then Rose, who's also a character, 2 characters in the book, is for a tribute to my mother, who sadly and tragically was taken from me as I wrote this in 2007 with pancreatic cancer at the age of 60. But fortunately, she let me, she was able to hear the first couple of pages, and she was my inspiration, as conservative as she was in life, who said, well, Jen, aren't you going to have some romance? When is that coming into play? So I did. I responded to my mom's request, and I put some romance in there for her.
Thank you so much. This has been great, and we recorded this author talk. So for those of you who'd like to go back and relive it, it'll be there. Or if you have friends that couldn't make it, This will be put up on our library's YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and type in Kingston Public Library, and you'll see our wonderful logo there, and we'll make this available. But thank you so much. This has been by far the biggest author event we've had since we've been doing these online events. So thank you so much. And thank everybody for coming out and all the great questions. This has been a really edifying night. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Everyone stay well and safe.
Very
Thank you.
well.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you.
much.
Good night.
Very nice.